Thank you very much indeed. And I hope you'll permit me to begin with a small personal story. My family connection to Greece goes back now 2 generations. I don't know whether my father actually got to know Andreas Papandreou in the 1940s at Harvard, but by the late 1950s, they were contemporaries and colleagues, as Andreas had become the chairman of the economics department at the University of California at Berkeley. My father was, of course, rising at Harvard. The most famous culmination of their relationship came in April of 1967, when the CIA-backed military coup took over in Athens. Andreas was arrested, and the word came out on the evening news that he was about to be shot. Now, in the United States at the time, the execution of an economics professor was considered a somewhat serious matter, and his professional colleagues all had the idea that perhaps my father's connections to President Johnson might be helpful. Those connections were sour by that time over the Vietnam War, but my dad did call the White House, reached Jack Valenti. Valenti took a note up to the presidential rooms sometime after midnight, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, a call came to my parents' house. It was Nicholas Katzenbach, the Assistant Secretary of State, with a message from the president that he wished to read to my father verbatim, and did. It was, "Nick, call Ken Galbraith and tell him I've told those Greek bastards to lay off that son of a bitch, whoever he is." I first visited Greece as an adult, actually, in 2006 to speak at a ceremony on the 10th anniversary of Andreas's death. It was shortly after my father's passing as well. And I returned in 2010 to lend moral support mainly to the immediately embattled government of George Papandreou. On a visit in 2011, I made the acquaintance for the first time of Yanis Varoufakis, and soon thereafter helped to arrange his 2-year sojourn at the University of Texas. In 2015, he resigned that professorship to become candidate for the Greek Parliament, and shortly thereafter was finance minister. And I had the privilege of assisting the Greek government during the 5 months of his tenure. The search for original sin in the Greek matter is recursive. There is always another layer. The country has never been well governed, not since the Ottomans, and certainly not before either, either internally or well treated externally. In the run-up to the world crisis, loans were made under illusions, delusions, and corruption, but this was mutual between Greece, Europe, and the global financial circuits. Greece was a bad borrower. Europe and the Eurozone were and are unsustainable confederacies, a form of government that we abandoned on this continent in 1865. And the world capitalist system was fueled by the miasma of deregulated mortgage finance emanating from the United States. The collapse was not a sudden discovery of a missing bezel, to use the term that my father coined in 1955 for the funds missing from corporate treasuries following an embezzlement. But the shock of realization that gambling was going on in the global casino, a phenomenon that rippled out from the United States through Europe and to Greece. The response in 2010 of the great and the good was, of course, or had, of course, very little, I would argue, next to nothing to do with the economy or the welfare of Greece. I would refer to the document that Professor Serafeim has presented, which describes in very measured tones the 2010 agreement. The austerity measures, he says, were designed to accommodate debt to GDP target levels at a given point in the future. Those were set to ensure the sustainability of a country's debt. making a series of assumptions regarding, amongst others, growth rates, public spending, tax revenues, and privatization receipts. The primary surpluses, in turn, informed what austerity measures were needed. That is a very dry description of what actually happened. In the world as it was, the German and French governments were willing to assume the debts of the Greeks in order to save their own bankers. The European Central Bank bought up distressed Greek bonds through the securities market program to support their price, essentially for the same reason. The International Monetary Fund came in to prescribe a program with a loan 32 times quota, the largest in IMF history, over the opposition of some of the executive directors and, let's see if I can pull this up here, and of the staff who are quoted in internal IMF documents at the time as stating that the significant uncertainties around this make it difficult to state categorically that the debt would be sustainable with high probability. While certain entities, the Australian, for example, emphasized the risks of repeating the mistakes made in the Asian crisis in terms of imposing too much structural conditionality. Exceptionally high risks were recognized by the IMF itself internally and overridden, in part because the managing director of the IMF at the time, a man of impeccable ethical standards by the name of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, wanted to be president of France. Greece was subjected, therefore, to an economics of deceit and delusion. A 5% GDP shortfall was projected with full recovery by around 2013, and you know very well what actually happened instead. During the interval from 2010 to the start of 2015, 3 Greek governments were destroyed by the effects of the world crisis and the economic program. In that period, Yanis Varoufakis, Stuart Holland, a former Labour MP, now teaching in Portugal, and I, refined what we called a modest proposal for the reconstruction of the Eurozone and the assistance of all the countries who were afflicted by the crisis, with 4 elements, all of them within the ambit of the existing treaties and charters, capable, in fact, of being put into effect under existing legal structures, not requiring a move to a new federation or new constitutional entities. These included debt restructuring through the European Central Bank, case-by-case resolution of insolvent banking institutions, an investment program animated by the European Investment Bank and European Investment Fund, and my own contribution, a program of solidarity payments to the most vulnerable households in the Eurozone, particularly along the lines of the American Food Stamps program. At no time was this program, which I think was and remains a sensible program for European reform, ever placed on an agenda for serious discussion, either before or during the first wave of the Syriza government in Greece. When the government took power, it was faced with an extremely difficult short-term situation, which had to do with the fact that the assistance program, which could have been extended for 6 months, was only extended for 2, and the government had a series of financial deadlines and was therefore under pressure to negotiate on nothing except the conditions under which those deadlines might possibly be met. So the major topics of the negotiation did not have to do with the debt, which was, as I think we understood at the time, not the central, immediate, or short-term question, but rather with the terms and conditions affecting the economic performance of Greece and the basic welfare of the most vulnerable people. These had to do first and foremost at the macro level with the primary surplus target, which was and had been entirely unreasonable, and in fact was adopted, I think, in the previous government because an unreasonable target was a trade-off for actually doing some of the more damaging things, but that was not an option for the new government. So to seek to achieve a certain degree of realism about what could be achieved on a sustainable basis on the primary surplus was for the Greek government an important preliminary step. Secondly, preserving the incomes of the pension recipients at the lowest end of the spectrum, those who were receiving on the whole on the order of €350 a month, in a system where pensions had already been reduced on the order of 44 to 49%. Pension funds had been deeply damaged by the 2012 debt write-downs, and the entire elderly population was living in an extremely stressed situation, on the verge or well into poverty and destitution. Thirdly, pacing terms and conditions of privatization, proposition even the most elementary neoclassical economists ought to be able to appreciate is that when you put everything on the auction block at once, you tend to get a very weak price offer from the potential buyers. And the idea that the government had, which was not dogmatic about privatization at all, was that some of the upside should be preserved for the Greek taxpayer, and that the pace of these sales should be done in a way that actually fiscally benefits the Greek state and without simply passing the assets into the hands of interests associated with the creditors. And finally, labor standards, where collective bargaining and the minimum wage were at issue, and the issue was whether Greece would be subjected continually to an unethical experiment in labor market deregulation, or allowed to enjoy the same standards that the International Labor Organization has promulgated and that are enjoyed elsewhere in Europe. Would these steps have by themselves reversed the destruction of Greece? No. But they would have opened the door to a further discussion of economic policy terms that might have placed the Greek economy on a more sustainable path and permitted an eventual restructuring of the debt on agreeable and honorable terms. Was, as I've said, the debt the principal issue that was faced? No, again, but it was an argument over policy that was conducted under the coercion of a short-term cash squeeze. The hope on the side of the Greek government at the time was to persuade the European leadership at the highest levels to respect the election result and to negotiate in good faith. That did not happen. The Eastern countries opposed it for ideological reasons. They were committed to the hardcore austerity programs in their own countries, were not prepared to concede that anything different could be admitted anywhere else. Portugal, Spain, and Ireland opposed it for internal political reasons. Governments were at risk from the rise of Podemos, of the Bloc Izquierda, and Sinn Féin, and were not prepared to encourage a political movement that might then, whose success might then redound in their own subsequent elections. The International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank opposed it for reasons of bureaucratic power. ECB was particularly upset at having its negotiations conducted in hotels rather than very visibly in the ministries in Athens. And the ECB actually destabilized the Greek banking system methodically in the first 5 months of 2015, promulgating, in effect, a slow run on the banks in order to weaken the bargaining position of the government, something that was quite effective, but quite out of line with the ordinary function of a central bank. And in the center of power in Germany, but also to a degree in France, political and financial forces were opposed both for internal and external reasons. The SPD in Germany in particular, not wishing to face the fate of PASOK, was not willing to give any openings to the Greek government, and of course the finance minister, Herr Schäuble, who was in many ways a very honest and direct interlocutor, a man who did not mince words, and that was highly appreciated, was very categorical in his views. None of this, as I think you can tell, had anything to do with the prospects for recovery of the Greek economy or the welfare of the Greek people. Finance ministry was accused of playing games, but actually on the contrary, it met payments again and again that in a more resolute frame of mind it might well have skipped. It did so in order to demonstrate good faith in the hopes that when a decision finally had to be made, which we knew would come on around the 30th of June, that there would be a decision to have an inclusive and politically viable pluralistic Europe. That, of course, again, did not happen. The decision taken at the European level was to attempt to destabilize and to defeat the government. In the end, the government, in effect, defeated itself. It had made a decision that it did not have the capacity to push a confrontation past a certain point. The Greek people took a different view. They were braver than the government that they had. And so came in July the capitulation and the accession of the government to effectively terms that were dictated entirely from outside of Greece. The dry language of the balance sheets, which you've seen, I think, will, as accountants, have revealed to you what is really going on in the present environment, which is essentially a debt collection process, a land grab, a foreclosure policy, a policy of taking as much as possible of the state's assets, of bringing the bankruptcies of businesses to fruition as rapidly as possible, and of pressing many households into default on their mortgages and ultimately foreclosure and loss of their homes. The dispossession, in other words, of a European population from the ownership of capital assets in its own country, or the transformation, if you like, of a European state to something that will resemble more like a Caribbean dependency of the United States. People stripped of assets in lieu of paying debts from which they never benefited very much in the first place. I will close by just giving you a short few lines from, I think, an appropriate text, which was written by John Maynard Keynes in 1919 and applied to Germany. This is from the preface of my book, Welcome to the Poison Chalice. Keynes wrote, "The policy of degrading the lives of millions of human beings and depriving a whole nation of happiness should be abhorrent and detestable. Abhorrent and detestable, even if it were possible, even if it enriched ourselves, even if it did not sow decay of the whole civilized life of Europe." Obviously, as you can tell, I think, from the news, the spirit of rebellion is growing again, and spreading, by the way, beyond Greece. As you can see that in the outcome of the Portuguese elections, the Spanish elections, and in the changing attitude, somewhat more discreet, but I think quite perceptible, of the Italian government. And since there is in Greece no longer a political outlet, it will become much more unpleasant as the fires burn. That's the price, ultimately, that both Greeks and Europeans will bear from accepting a set of policy recommendations dictated by economists, driven by ideology, and utterly disconnected from the reality of what it might take to restore a viable economic and social entity on that particular outskirt of Europe. Thank you very much.